now your story talks a bit about how Rhode Island in particular, the state legislature in June approved this new pilot program for meant to target housing. Can you talk a bit about that program and what makes it different, and what makes it encouraging, maybe something that other states could follow?
Yeah, and I should say, and this was my story, and I feel bad about it, but it's certainly, it only adds to the thing. I actually learned following my story coming out. My story looked at a couple of states. Rhode Island was a big one, Colorado, Hawaii, California. It turns out, like 3 years ago, Massachusetts actually, I think Massachusetts was first, and that they have been doing on a smaller scale. But what they've been doing, which is really new, some like arguably not done since pre-New Deal, is the state is stepping up saying we're going to put money in to develop new mixed income housing, affordable and market rate, and we're going to own it, and that's going to be. And I think something to understand is that, and you kind of briefly mentioned this earlier, but in the 1990s, Congress like basically effectively made it so that it's really, really hard now to build any new federal public housing due to something called the Faircloth Amendment. That's something Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been trying to repeal, but it is still around. And so it's why, I mean, right now with federal public housing, there's tens of billions of dollars in backlog repairs. That's where the leaky roofs and the clogged toilets and the mold and the asbestos, all of that stuff that's not getting repaired. Congress is behind in funding those repairs, but they also are not building new units. We're fighting to maybe keep the units we have intact and out of disrepair. So what's really interesting and to me exciting about what's happening in those states I was mentioning earlier, like Rhode Island, is they're saying, okay, the federal government can't build new public housing for all the reasons we just talked about, but we are going to invest ourselves, and we are going to build new housing, and we're going to own it, which is really sort of kind of, a very different way of thinking about housing, because a lot of times the way affordable housing development has kind of worked in the past is like they've been on these like 15-20 year subsidy things, and the government will basically give tons and tons of subsidies to a private company, and then the private company will build it, and they will be under certain restrictions about how high they can charge in rent. But then after the 15-20 years runs up, then it's out of their hands, and then might not even stay affordable after that, and it can become in the private hands. So this is like new in the sense that they're building housing, and they're saying, and we're going to keep it, and we're going to also capture all the value that comes from owning that unit, and we might be able to reinvest that in more housing production or other social services. And so I find it like a very interesting example of how the public sector is thinking about flexing its muscles that they haven't really done in a very long time.
Well, I mean, it's common sense, frankly, if taxpayer money, not to use an old, I guess, small c conservative political term, but if taxpayer money is going towards the subsidization of this, then the government should own it. They should be the public developer of this project, as opposed to just subsidizing it under private management, which is wildly inefficient, but it's just a way to get around the easiest answer to these questions, which I think a lot of members of our government don't actually want to reckon with. It reminds me of, I use this example all the time, during COVID, Nancy Pelosi bending over backwards for COBRA subsidies as opposed to temporarily expanding Medicare, because,
Right.
We can't do that because of what that might lead to, as opposed to just doing what's most straightforward.
And I do think part of what's happening here is, public housing, federal public housing, doesn't have a great reputation right now. I think part of that is because, of rules and defunding that Congress has done. And it doesn't mean all public housing has to be bad. We have strong models elsewhere, and some states do a better job than others. But what it has meant is that people there's a lot of skepticism right now that the government can get in the housing game and do it well, and like that there's a, well, they think of the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, which is sort of like the notorious example of you know segregated, underfunded, problematic towers. And so part of what I think is, for all the people who are getting into this space, they're saying, look, yes, mistakes were made. Yes, we know there are all these problems with the federal housing program, but that doesn't mean we can't get it right. And that doesn't mean we're doomed to make the same mistakes again. And so I think a lot of what's happening now, and a really sort of very competent, kind of successful place where this is happening, is in Montgomery County, Maryland, and that's at the county level. But like that's a place where they are showing how this can be done, how it can be done in the kind of apartments you or I would probably love to live in, like next to transit, really nice looking. You wouldn't even know it's public housing in the traditional sense of what we sort of imagine that to look like. And I think part of what this will require is just getting like some more proof points, like Montgomery County, like maybe like Rhode Island, more like Massachusetts and Colorado and Hawaii, to sort of help people kind of shake the stereotype of what they think American governments building housing can look like and mean, because we have such a stigmatized image based on how the federal program has kind of shaken out.
Well, the federal program, they've made it anemic, and then they say, well, it's unfixable. And so
Exactly.
we're putting a moratorium on it. And when you talk about Montgomery County, that is a suburb, right? And so that, I think, changes the conversation around public housing as well, and also just the outcomes, because
Right.
we've seen urban sprawl, people having to move out of the cities in order to afford a place to live. And it, when you, I think, make public housing more widespread as opposed to confines to certain areas of cities, then you're including middle class renters as well, as you write about, which might make these programs more durable.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Like we have this idea of like public housing being this thing only in like low income, you know, uh, majority black neighborhoods in urban areas, which like is not. I mean, it's like we know the affordable housing crisis is affecting people all over. It's not limited to there. We can use, governments can be helping people all over. I think that's why, um, the thing that a lot of lawmakers were basically saying was like, we just this crisis is so bad, we need to be more aggressive about how we get involved. And I think you're right that like showing that we can kind of showing that you can do this in rural areas, you can do this in suburbs, you can do this in cities, and it could benefit. Some people would probably live in those units and pay market rent, which will help keep it going. And we also know that there are so many middle class families who are really struggling with housing right now too. This is definitely not only limited to the very poor, but we have a problem right now where there's just not even enough units for people to live in as their grow families and population goes up. So I think there's a lot of potential for this. Of course, like it will require capacity and planning and skills, and federal investment would be helpful. I think that was something that I kind of heard from people, which was saying like they're hoping that if they can kind of show they have that they can do this on the state level, that will then HUD hopefully will, there's things HUD can do to support the state and local governments that want to pursue this, and hopefully they're paying attention.